So you're listening to Salford City Radio 94.4 FM with your host Jimmy Petruzzi on the Friday Sports Show. We bring you fascinating guests on this show. We bring you guests from around the world. Our aim is to increase participation in the local area and awareness, and we're very fortunate to have guests on the show from a variety of backgrounds related to sport from around the world. We've had some of the best athletes in the world, footballers as well, and coaches. But also we bring to you people around the world, and to give us an insight into what goes on. It's very easy to sort of forget it's a big wide world out there. And today's guest is there's probably no one better than him on his CV in terms of well-travelled in football, who's going to give us some insights into where he's been. He's been all the way in New Zealand, in Mexico. He's worked in Africa as well, and as well as the Grenada at the moment. But I'm sure you'll tell us a lot more about what he's doing and give you guys, listeners, a fascinating insight. And do feel free to get in touch on our Facebook page, the Friday Sports Show, the Weekly Sports Show on Facebook, Salford, and put your questions forward. It's always interesting to get some feedback and your thoughts. So, Harry, Varley, welcome to the show. Great to have you on board. Great to have you on the show.
Thank you very much. Very, very happy to be on.
Yeah, and it's a really fascinating background you've got, Harry. I mean, you sort of travelled pretty much every corner of the globe, and so for you, where does your sort of football journey begin? I mean, the listeners, I know that'll be really fascinating to hear, some of your experiences around the world. But where does it sort of begin for you? Where does the sort of football coaching journey begin for you?
So the journey kind of started for me at the end or so. I grew up in the south of England in Devon, playing for an amateur team there. We trained like once a week, and I was always really frustrated by the experience. I never found that we were training in a way that I felt was going to prepare us the best way. So when I got to 16, me and a couple of friends set up a team of our own at a very, very low level of the football pyramid, and that was my first kind of go at coaching and playing at the same time. And then I moved to Leeds to study philosophy, so was doing different little projects to do with football at the time. And then as I finished that course in Leeds, then I got the opportunity to go to the States. So my first professional football experience was in the US. So I went out there for a year and was doing the soccer camps and traveling around, and it gave me a flavour for the opportunity to travel with football, and also kind of just another kind of spur to keep going and make it more professional and see what I could do personally and what the game had to offer in general. It's
really interesting you say, you mentioned Devon, and sort of, obviously it's a beautiful part of the world, but the point being is that where football's concerned, we don't sort of, well, at least not in my experience, hear too much of what goes on there football-wise. Traditionally in the UK, you've got obviously the Northwest, which has been a hotbed for football. Obviously the Northeast, you've got the London clubs. But in terms of growing up, what were some of the teams that you sort of, you did, not necessarily supported, but sort of, what were the closest teams to you, Harry, locally? Were there any teams, what was the closest teams to you in Devon?
So the big teams, or the bigger teams at the time, were Exeter City, Plymouth Argyle and Torquay. So I used to go to watch Exeter quite a lot. I would travel down to watch Plymouth and Torquay, and then occasionally Bristol's a little bit further up, a little bit more in towards the centre of the UK, so occasionally we'd go up to see Bristol games as well. And as I said, like, things have changed a lot now. I'm aware that the football landscape is changing very quickly in the UK, and things are getting much more professional and much more full-time in terms of youth development. But growing up at that time, it was very, very amateur, very old school in regards to the way that they did things. They were picking the kid that had a mustache at 13 was the kid that was being picked for the centre of excellence. And I just found it a very frustrating experience, because my amateur team, we were winning all the time. We thought we were winning anyway, and that's a big theme that I kind of come back to now. Is is how you win at youth level is not a guarantee that you're going to go on to success. It's not the best way to prepare young players to be individual footballers. So yeah, it took me the coaching experience, the learning of the game through coaching to really reflect and understand what was going on at that time.
Yeah, it's a great point. I think certainly things have changed a lot in the academies and centre of excellences in the UK, and I think, like you said there, development was a huge. Well, from a point of view of physical development, that would have a big influence on recruitment, at least in years gone by. Now, there's a bit more of a balanced view in terms of footballing ability as well, where obviously it's important to have the ability. It's one thing being fast and strong, but that generally evens itself out as you get a bit older. So for me, sometimes certain players have been missed on purely footballing ability because at that certain age they weren't necessarily physically developed. But that's interesting really in terms of your education too. I mean, studying philosophy, for me, I really think that having some sort of philosophy in football goes a long way to developing your own style of coaching and your own way of being. And did you find that your studies influenced you as a coach in any way, Harry, or is it just something that you sort of did and sort of put to one side?
I mean, I really think that studying philosophy has informed the career and the different parts of the world that I've travelled to. I don't think without having that inbuilt desire to question and to learn and to really develop an understanding, I would have been able to succeed in some of the environments, especially Africa and the experience in Cambodia were very challenging and really, from a cultural point of view, really incredibly alien to begin with. And I think if you're not adaptable, if you're not able to explore and try to work out why the things, because I had this idea that you could just transplant technical and tactical and all of this and you could just take that and put that anywhere, and then I quickly began to realize that the football is a reflection of culture, and if you don't key into the culture, if you don't understand how football is being perceived and interacted with in each different environment, you're on the road to failure. You're never going to have any of the impact that you really want to have.
Yeah, it's really interesting stuff that you say there. Obviously, you've experienced it so firsthand, and that sort of counts for a lot. And no doubt we've got people listening who are coaches or looking to get into coaching as well. And I think that, for me, is invaluable in terms of understanding and being aware and embracing the culture you're in and how that influences the way people play on the pitch, but also live their lives off the pitch as well. Because I think one of the things for me, my experience when I've worked in different countries as well, Harry, I don't know if it's been the same for you, you look at things from the point of view that in training you're there for, say, an hour or two, a few hours, but outside training, the days sometimes, outside doing work and other administration, you've got sort of time sometimes to explore and look at different things. And did you find yourself in situations where, when you're outside the actual coaching environment, in different countries, did you sort of find yourself getting to know and interacting with locals, or did you sort of is that something you sort of managed to do yourself, or did you sort of keep yourself in the confinements of just the coaching people and staff around you?
No, I mean, it's always been a really big thing for me to get out and make the most of the experience, and really, if you can learn the language, or you can start to learn bits of the language, if you can find out what cultural symbols are important or how people are living their life, I think you have to have a context to what you're doing, and it's really, I didn't get that well enough when I first started. Maybe my first couple of experiences, I was just learning the ropes of coaching and managing groups and those sort of things. But as I've developed as a coach, as I've got more comfortable and more clear in the way that I want to do things, I think the main point for me is about getting into a community, into a country as quickly as possible, and being humble enough to experience everything with open eyes, so that you can then take that. I feel now, again, it's the same point. you cannot make that connection with your players or with your staff or the people that you need to influence if you don't get who they are. And so if you're just coming and you're sitting in your hotel or in your apartment and you're watching English films and English TV, you're not going to get it. You're always going to be an outsider, and you're never, those little details that bring success or is success in any way that you want to define it, you won't get them. You haven't earned them, I believe.
That's a great point. I sort of echo those sentiments in my experience, and I haven't worked in as many countries as yourself, but I had the opportunity to work in a few different places, and I think that it's really important to embrace the culture and get out there and get amongst it, really, because that helps to connect with the players too. But what I find quite interesting with your own career is that you sort of the diversity of not just the countries but also the programs you worked on, and like the likes of working in New Zealand and Uganda, and we'll sort of touch on his experiences shortly. But so for you, when you're working in New Zealand, what was that program? What did that involve, Harry? The program you worked in New Zealand. What did that program involve?
So there was two parts to the role in New Zealand. So I was working in the Tauranga area, in the Bay of Plenty area, with the Curver program. And again, it comes down to specific needs of the country. Obviously, New Zealand is a big rugby country, and they play football in general. Hopefully, I'm not going to get killed for this. With a rugby mindset, it comes back to that. What is the cultural language of the country? Is they have a rugby style to the football. So what we were trying to do with the Curver program was add some technique to that, add that Dutch style of technique training, to be able to give them more tools to make better football decisions, to maybe influence the style of football. And I was trying to develop futsal at the same time. I'm a huge advocate for futsal, and I wish that it was being taken more seriously in the UK as well. I've seen some development, but I think there's still one more notch that English football can go up if it properly embraced futsal. And that was what I was trying to do in New Zealand as a dovetail with the Curver program. So that was the kind of football side. And then I've always found, from my time in Leeds, I did a program where it was called a Monday night football session, and we were bringing gangs together and just connecting with them through a football session. And it was eye-opening to me how football can be used as a tool for social change. And so I signed up to do a similar project in New Zealand in the youth justice facility in Rotorua, and the same thing. It was a very challenging environment. Those boys were coming from very, very difficult homes, and most of them had no interest in football, if I'm honest. Like, they were all rugby boys. But you manage to, or football manages to break down so many barriers and allows you a different way to connect with people. And I'm such a huge advocate in any role that I'm in, that I'm given the support and the opportunity to not only do the professional side of football, but also connect with marginalized communities or use football to empower or change lives, really.
Yeah, that's really powerful stuff, and I think definitely football is definitely a vehicle that can be used, and is certainly used to bring people together and get people out there in the communities, and certainly the sentiments you mentioned there. I think that in my experience, having sort of a colleague of mine, or more of an acquaintance, Doug Dale, who was the coach of New Zealand, shared that sort of sentiment in terms of New Zealand with people wanting to be rugby. And another colleague of mine, Roger, who's doing some technical work in New Zealand at the moment, he also shared that sentiment in terms of, the young people growing up in New Zealand, their first sort of choice, if they're going to tick a box, is to be a rugby player, an All Black, so to speak. So I think that, from that point of view, did you sort of find it as being a bit of a challenge, Harry, sort of getting out there and trying to engage young people to do football, or did you find that basically people sort of took to it, the young people sort of took to it pretty well, or was that bit of resistance that they just wanted to play rugby instead?
I think with young people are easy. What I always find is it comes down to influencing the influencers. So it's the parents. It's about getting into the ear of the parents and getting them to understand the benefits of the sport, understanding the kind of crossover benefits. Even if you want to be a rugby player, then if you're doing both sports, your learning is improved. The development is much quicker if you're doing that kind of cross sport learning. So you always have, and what I found in New Zealand is a small community who are football fans, and whether they're some of the kind of Latino community, the migrant workers, and the kind of English people who are over there, they're already in there. So for me, it was about now kind of targeting communities like the Maori community, who maybe historically, traditionally are just rugby, getting them to engage with the sport. And once you have kids playing it, they love the sport. I mean, like, I've seen it around the world. It's the world's game, because all you need is a football and everyone can play.
Absolutely,
It's not difficult with the young people.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great point, and it's a non-intrusive game in the sense that, from minimal injury point of view, obviously you can pick up an injury playing any sport. Yeah, that's said and done, you're more likely to pick up an injury in rugby, particularly if you're not conditioned to play the game physically. You know, they're great athletes, and they spend a lot of time in conditioning themselves to play at the highest level. And that's not undermining rugby. I'm a fan of rugby too. Yet football, you just need a couple of jumpers, so to speak, and put some goalposts out of football, and you're on the way. In that respect, is a huge level. Then you sort of you worked in Mexico too, I believe, Harry. That's quite interesting in terms of the experience there. And Mexico is, I guess, a more of a traditional footballing nation. They've had some success and produced some good footballers. But what was your experience like in Mexico? That would have been a really interesting experience, I would have thought.
Yeah, so Mexico was my first experience of working in a country where I didn't speak the language. I've learned Spanish now, but when I arrived there, I didn't speak a word. And so that was a huge challenge. The weather, the food, everything. That was like the first time where I was totally out of my comfort zone. But it's also where I got the most growth, because it's a well-trodden path. But once you get out of your comfort zone is where you start to learn who you are, where you can improve, like what the good bits are about yourself as well. I think sometimes when you're surrounded by comfort, you don't recognize where your strong points are, because nothing stands out, everything's at the same level. In terms of the football, it's an incredibly proud football nation, and so maybe they haven't had the success that they should have. And there's lots of political and socio-economic reasons why that is, but they are very, very proud of football. It means everything to them. So again, I was in there with a Curva program, and for me it was more about adapting that, because they're very technical players. It's a street football culture. And so coming in and doing the technical work that was really needed in New Zealand wasn't needed in Mexico. So I found my role was more about how do we take that application of the skill of the 1v1, the kind of extrovert side of football that was very popular there, and making that more efficient, more team orientated. So not removing it, but decision making about when to do it, where to do it, how to do it. And that was, it was really challenging for me, because it was the first time that I was working with a syllabus, but I was aware that the syllabus maybe wasn't exactly appropriate for the style and the needs of the players. And I think that's really important for young coaches to understand is if I'm your technical director and I write you a program, that doesn't remove the responsibility of you applying that program based on the individual needs of your player and your team. Yes,
yeah. That's a really interesting point. It's a great point. I think that sometimes it's easy to sort of, we see it sometimes in centre of excellences and even in academies where certain, not so much now, but in the past, they look to play a certain system and they allocate players to positions rather than experiencing different positions and different systems. And sometimes it can be a bit by the book. And I've often sort of put the question, there are certain players in years gone by that have gone unidentified. Really talented players, I think, in Centre of Excellences that have gone unidentified because the system's been relatively rigid. But things have changed a lot, like you mentioned earlier in the UK. It's not like it used to be, but I believe it still has a long way to go. A lot of great players are being produced now, or as good as for a long time. But that's a great point you've made there. It's really interesting too, because from Mexico, then you got the experience of working in Africa. Now that would be really fascinating, I think. For the listeners, for myself, it's really, really curious about your experiences in Africa. Now that's obviously culturally different again, and a different environment again to where you'd been prior to that. Can you tell us a bit about your experiences in Africa, Harry? What was that like, and where did you work there in Rwanda and Uganda? That would have been really fascinating.
So after my experience in Cambodia, I briefly came to Grenada for the first time to work with the men's national team, and then got the opportunity to be the technical director of an academy in Uganda. So the idea of the academy was to select the best young players from across Uganda, going into Kenya and Rwanda, and then South Sudan and DRC as well. And then the boys would come in, boys, and then eventually we brought in girls towards the end of my time with the program. And it was a full-time residential training program, so we provided education, medical care, and then full-time training. And for me, honestly, the connection to football in Africa, I've never seen anywhere else. I was close in Mexico. I mean, Mexico is a football place. It's in everything, but just because of the conditions of life in Uganda, in East Africa, to be a footballer involves so much sacrifice. It involves so much risk that I don't think you can compare that connection to anything, as far as I'm seeing anyway. And
wow.
I'm always open to being proved wrong, but what kids and families would do for the opportunity to join our academy and for that possibility. And we're talking about East Africa as well, not West Africa. Has a long tradition of exporting players. It's an industry there now, for good and for bad. East Africa still has the tag. Everybody believes that they're runners. They have some fame, obviously, with the Kenyan long distance runners. Yeah. So in the Western world, there's a lot of skepticism. There's a lack of interest in really exploring that area. So we were working in an environment where they haven't seen much success from local players, from players that they know going out, but still the desire to do it, to achieve that dream meant what I could do on a training field with those kids is very, very hard to replicate. It's very, very hard to be able to get that level of intensity, the level of skill quality, because they're just ready to go every day. They're ready to push. And I think one of the biggest differences that I see around the different environments I've worked in is that culture of some clubs, some organizations, you're having to drag players through, drag staff through every day. What you're looking for is that it's a group of individuals who all want to push harder than the next one to achieve greatness. And that's what I found, especially in the environment that we had in Uganda. Rwanda was slightly different. That was a second division club, and again, it was an amazing opportunity for me. The level of the players wasn't as high. Rwanda is a little bit more developed than Uganda, and it's some of the modern trappings of the Western world are taking over there. So that starts to take away the desire from players. It starts to distract them, and they start to value things that aren't as important to their development as they should be. But just the historic context of the country was very fascinating as well, to see the effects of the genocide and how that touches on everything that's going on there. It was both experiences for me were massive, and as I said, Mexico was my first real huge learning curve on and off the field, and Africa was the second one. I don't think you can't be prepared going to Africa. Like it knocks you down, and you got to get up and respond.
Yeah, and so your experience, that's quite interesting. I mean, we'll sort of touch on the level of football there and how you would rate it in terms of comparatively to teams over here. But general day-to-day life. I mean, what was that like for you in Rwanda and Uganda? Obviously, I know that's going to be different, but in terms of you've made some really interesting points there, and now that we've got coaches who probably are aspiring at one point to work in different countries, in general, day-to-day life, you sort of touched on some of the things that have happened politically in the past that influenced the society over there now. But what was it like, day-to-day outside training, Harry? What sort of things did you did from a social point of view, from a point of view of just general life? What was that like?
So if I'm honest, it's very, very hard. Like the hardest thing I've done by a long shot. We often, where I was in Uganda, especially Rwanda, was different because I was in the capital. And as I said, as a country, it's much more developed. But Uganda is a developing nation, and in the north, where the academy was based, we would often go without power for weeks. We would have water shortages a lot of the time, especially at this time of year now, as the dry season approaches. The heat kicks up. It's normally around 30 degrees. It starts to push up towards 40. And then when your power cuts out, you've got no air conditioning, you've got no fan, no nothing. And then when the water goes as well, then it starts to become a real challenge. So I think there's other places where I've traveled where I say you can ease your way in from the moment you arrive into the airport in Uganda. You are like, the experience is 100%, and you got to be ready for it. And obviously there's malaria, and right now there's the second biggest Ebola outbreak ever going on. So there are lots of extra things that you are having to deal with on a day-to-day basis. They don't look after the roads. Often you're working especially for my side, doing the recruitment. We'd be driving 5 hours into the middle of the bush on dirt roads in kind of old second-hand clapped out vans that are breaking down every 5 seconds. Like, it was an amazing experience. Honestly, in terms of getting out of your comfort zone, really understanding how fortunate you are, how much privilege you're afforded, and seeing what life is really like around the world.
That's a great point.
You can't exchange that experience. I mean, it did so much for me on a personal level.
That's a great point, and certainly our listeners, I think that'll be really fascinating for them to get a really honest outlook about your experience out there, and it's really, really fascinating stuff, because you've obviously got that going on off the field, but in training you're sort of planning and structuring sessions and looking to do what you do from a recruitment point of view. In Rwanda, what would you say the team you're working with there, are you able to sort of give us an idea what standard that would be comparatively to, say, the UK, or is it too difficult to sort of go like for like? Where would you say that would sit in the UK in terms of standards? Harry, is it something that you can sort of give us a rough idea as to where that'd be?
I would say for the second division, the problems that you have in comparing is the state of the pitches, and then just the general level of, there's very little tactical play, there's very little of a coaching culture. So and I think the biggest thing that affects African football, and I don't know, I feel like it's not really being touched upon right now. You have obviously Salah, and you have Mane, and you have Aubameyang. You have a couple of guys who are elite, but I would say the general standard of football from the African continent is very low right now. I think, or is very, maybe it's not low, but maybe it's very average. And this comes from the whole continent is rife with age cheating. So players are 10 years older or 5 to 10 years older than what they're saying they are. And we had this huge challenge with the academy in Uganda around identifying and getting correct ages, because it's just the norm. And it's done because the players that are going out have a certain physical and athletic appearance that isn't reflective of what, I mean, we're talking about countries where some of the kids that came into our academy might be eating once every 3 days. They might have meat once a month. So the idea that they're going to come out looking like these big chiseled muscly guys is ridiculous. The growth cycles are much slower. An 18-year-old in Uganda looks like a 14 or 13-year-old in a Western world. So what you're getting is all of those skillful, clever, intelligent players aren't getting their go. They don't get the opportunity until 10 years later down the road, until they're physically developed, because instead they're picking all these very big, strong, older guys. And I think that is part of the reason that it's difficult to compare. Is, I would say, the team that I was working with would be probably a 7th or 8th tier in the UK, because there's very little tactical work and it's all just about physicality. It's all individual physical battles, and very little use of skillful players or players with insight. But that's not to say that that's because they're not. They are there. I've worked with them. I've seen them in all of my recruitment trips. When you're working with the kids at 12, 13, they have exceptional technical ability. I mean, the kids that I work with in Uganda are the best kids I've ever worked with, like hands down, incredible talent. But they would just not get the opportunities. It is not the way it's done. They want the guys who are very, very big and strong, and they're old because they just there's no way that they develop that quickly over there.
Yeah, and that's really interesting stuff. And I believe, well, I'm sort of going off information. Well, I'm going off what I've heard. So I don't know if it's 100% factual or not, but I do believe there's certain clubs in Europe and the UK that do sort of, whether it's ethically right or wrong is a different matter, but they do sort of test for chronological age in certain situations to see if the player is the age they say. Is that something that you ever came across yourself, Harry, or is it just one of them things that sort of just gets traction, but there's no reality in it? Is that sort of testing, bone density testing? Or I'm not an expert in that area, but it's just something I've heard that has happened at certain clubs. I could be completely off the mark, but you ever come across that before?
I mean, from what I saw, I don't believe that's the case at all. I don't think it benefits the clubs to do that.
Yes.
And the players that were going out of Uganda and Kenya that I was aware of were not the correct age. And I'm pretty sure that the clubs were aware of that.
Yes.
So there could be that. I mean, on the East Africa side of things, there's not many clubs going out there anyway. There's some little sponsorship, so Everton and Southampton had some small deals with Sport Pacer, so they were coming out to do tours. But they weren't properly organised. They weren't done in a serious and kind of concerted effort. So I would say that the recruitment is actually going on that side of the continent. I know it's very different in West Africa.
Yeah.
But as I said to you, it wouldn't be of any benefit for a club to pick a 13-year-old in Uganda because they're so small, and the pressure that you have in academies for kids to compete and perform. Yeah. And it's still not gone. It's definitely better, but I still don't think they give players enough time. They don't give them enough support. You see too many stories of guys who are dropped and people like Harry Kane, who was released because he was small. Like, that to me is just crazy. That's still going on.
Yes.
So I don't think it's being done, and I'm not even convinced that there's an effective method of doing it. Yeah, if you have people falling through the cracks in the UK, there's no way that they would be able to do it in such a disorganised environment.
Yeah, that's really
fascinating.
Like
you have over there.
That's really fascinating to hear it sort of firsthand, and I've heard stories where, and sometimes these stories are hearsay. I don't know for sure, but I've heard stories that certain clubs have sort of questioned the age of players and sort of consider doing bone density to see if they are the age. So like you said before, in terms of players being older than what they say they are, obviously they look different maturation wise. But I think that the challenge for the club then would be is how much more will they develop physically and technically from that point of view. But it is no doubt a contentious issue and it's a sensitive area. But I in one sense I can understand the rationale of certain players based on the living conditions. That I think for me, in my opinion, it's more than just football. It's an opportunity for players to be able to, from a financial point of view, it's one thing being a footballer if you're in the Western world. Don't get me wrong, people are motivated, they want to do well as they can do. But if you're living in poverty, in my opinion, it could be a way out. And we see a lot of African players that are very generous with their finances and do help out communities immensely back in Africa. And did you get the impression yourself, Harriet, where that could be the case for certain players if they could make it in a European league? It was an opportunity for them to help their families, their communities, or is that something that's just a perception of mine or certain people who may not know firsthand?
I mean, I would say 99% of them, that is their biggest motivation. I would say that I don't recall any player in the academy in Uganda or in Rwanda who was doing it for any other reason than a sense of responsibility towards their family.
Wow.
And maybe when they get out and they're making money and they get all the trappings and maybe that changes and they get waylaid, but I would say their initial entry point to football is, and that's why I said it's a different connection, because it's love, but there's pressure from minute one. I mean, I saw a lot in Uganda of young kids, kind of 11, 12, being sold around different school competitions, and that money goes to their family, and so their family is supportive of it, even though it's obviously not correct and shouldn't be the experience of the kid. But that's the way that it's being processed, football. That's the way that they interact with it. Is football is a means of supporting your family, and that's why the kids are so desperate to do it and be successful.
Yeah, and that's really, really powerful stuff, and it's a very powerful insight, firsthand of your experience. And we sort of hear about the more traditional footballing nations in Africa, the Ghana, Nigeria, Cameroon, Ivory Coast, and the players they've produced over the years. But it's very rare we get an insight into the likes of Rwanda and Uganda. That's been really, really fascinating, no doubt. And in terms of yourself, I mean, you had the experience, and I believe you working in the Cayman Islands as well. Or, what was that experience like for yourself, Harry? The actual Cayman Islands, the experience like for you?
Well, as I mentioned, in a slight contrast between Uganda and Rwanda, as the country starts to get more developed, then that connection with football begins to change. And I think you couldn't have a better example of that than the Cayman Islands, with the level of development, the level of affluence in the country. The biggest issue, and I work with both the women's and the men's national team, is a real lack of there's no push. Life is too comfortable for players, for young players especially in the Cayman Islands. It's very easy to get on the national team and become a star very young, and then really those kind of mental toughness skills, the things that are going to take you through a career, they aren't developed because life is very comfortable over there. And so when they travel to the UK on trials, or they get into the real football world and have to take the knocks, it's just too much for them. And I saw that there's some very talented players there, but the biggest issue, the biggest struggle for them is in the back of their mind. Their home is paradise, and so when you're getting lashed with rain and people are kicking you and all of this stuff, I think it's much more difficult to stay focused. Like, you're always going to have that at the back of your mind. So it was very interesting. It was another really challenging kind of environment, because how do you implant that in young people who love football, but do they really want to make it a career when they know that they can get a comfortable job back home and play football for fun?
Absolutely.
So yeah, it's fascinating.
Yeah, no, you've got to really desire different motives. So I mean, you go from one motive or the underlying desire of a majority of players, possibly in Africa, to sort of support themselves and their families financially, and then you sort of go to another end of the spectrum where people can get a job and play football, and you think, well, it takes a lot of training and dedication to be, and also on top of that, it's sort of moving away from your family, to different countries, not always easy in that respect, and all the things that go with that too. So it's quite fascinating. And where did you sort of stand on the women's game in your experience? I mean, where do you see the level there? It's quite an interesting one for me, because we've seen the women's game take some big strides over the last few years, but a lot of the emphasis seems to be on the major tournaments. But outside major tournaments, from what I can see, apart from maybe the likes of the USA, I mean, there's certain countries in Europe like the UK that are making grounds. But what was the women's game like in the Cayman Islands, Harry? Is it developing there, or where would you say that is at this moment in time?
So I would say, in comparison to the rest of the region, because of some of the financial restrictions that they had after the issues that they had with Jeffrey Webb, they were encouraged, or they were forced, I guess, to develop youth leagues for girls, and so that's really starting to bear fruit. There was some real talent in the age groups that I was working with, especially the under 14s and under 17s, and it just kind of helped to clarify, or continue to clarify, that if you actually properly invest in youth development for girls, get them young, give them the same level of access and quality of training, the level can just grow by such a huge degree. At the top end of the Cayman game, unfortunately the federation there are not serious about women's football and don't give them the support that they need, and I'm hopeful that will change. At the moment, I didn't see any evidence of that, and that's why I didn't continue in the role. But yeah, I think it's a general point. I think there's a lot of top-end investment, like you say. There's a lot of making everything look nice and shiny and talking a good game. But the reality is, I still don't believe that the investment is at the right end of the game, and the investing in making sure that the quality of training and development of players starts early enough and is done with the correct amount of seriousness.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, and it's certainly, from what I can see, it's a sentiment that's echoed even in the UK to a point, it's in certain levels where the traditional top clubs obviously have a lot more investment than I guess that's the same in the men's game to a point, but generally speaking, from what I can see in the women's game, the challenge is at grassroots, is to sort of encourage participation and get people involved, and which is not easy to do, because you're relying, I guess, on people doing it from a voluntary basis too, to get involved, and that's not always easy, but there has been strides taken. But I think sometimes the yardstick that's used in major tournaments is probably not truly reflective of how far the game probably needs to come along at a more youth level, but we shall see what happens there. And your role in Grenada, that's quite an interesting one, Harry. Can you tell us a bit about what you're doing now at the moment, what your role is in Grenada at the moment? That's quite interesting from what I can see, working out there, and what are your aims and objectives in the role you're in at the moment?
So I would say across the Caribbean, there's a real lack of infrastructure at the grassroots level, and so the ex-technical director of the Grenada Football Association and I have been working on a kind of foundation project here since I came in 2016, and really what we're trying to do is just fill in the gaps and start to like you just mentioned, activate the volunteer community, activate youth leagues, do everything that's missing, everything that should be being done by the Football Association here, that's not being done, is try to make that happen. Because what was fascinating for me, or shocking for me, when I came out with the national team in 2016, is that there were players on the national team who hadn't played their first competitive game of football until they were 15.
Wow.
And so they're just missing game time, they're missing training time, and so they have huge athletic potential. You can see with Grenada, they have Kirani James, and then they have world-class athletes coming off the island. But in terms of football, if you're not playing, if you're not doing your hours on the field in that football environment, you're lagging behind. And so really that's the aim of the project here, is to try and build grassroots and build that platform for young players, both boys and girls, to reach their potential, because I see there is huge potential here, and we would like it to be a pilot for the rest of the region as well, because there's not enough players coming out. People ask me, well, who is, since Dwight Yorke, who's the next player to come out of the region, and it's very few names really. Leon Bailey obviously, but other than that, it's just players are getting lost in the system.
That's interesting. I was going to actually ask you about that. What was the influence of Dwight Yorke and his success? I mean, was that influential in young people wanting to emulate what he achieved, or other sports sort of? No doubt there's other sports there which would be interesting to see what other sports you're sort of competing against, if you want to call it competing. But what was Dwight Yorke's influence over there in terms of young people seeing him and wanting to emulate that, Harry?
I mean, I guess unfortunately time moves on quickly, and so Dwight Yorke as a name really doesn't resonate with young people anymore. He's with the older generation, was obviously very popular and a real role model, but right now for the kids, and as I said before, it's mostly the parents that are our biggest challenge. Athletics is seen as the best way for kids to get scholarships, to get out and do something with sport, and then cricket is still, I would say, competing with football in regards to that. So there are very few football role models in the Caribbean right now, and that's one of the biggest things holding players getting out is they don't really believe, and often their relationship with the football bodies that are supposed to be helping them is very broken. And so you see players here who are kind of 10 to 15 who really have that dream, they have that fire in their belly, and then you see that same kid as they start to hit 18, 19, and they're already losing hope. They're already kind of not believing that there's a chance for them to go out. And again, a big part of our project is to find those pathways, so that they can genuinely see how, by investing their time in training and doing all of that at an early age, they do have an opportunity if they do the work.
It's an interesting point you make there, and one thing that sort of I reflect on is that the potential athletically. We've seen some tremendous athletes come from the Caribbean in all sports, in cricket, in basketball, in football. We've seen in athletics some tremendous athletes. So you can imagine that if there's a solid infrastructure for football, then players would be produced. I guess one challenge would be, I would think, is population in terms of. But then in saying that, what sort of population you need from a playing pool point of view to get a really competitive team? And I guess my question is, Harry, how far can, say, the likes of Grenada go in a footballing context? You've got obviously the talent there in terms of the athletic ability, that's for sure. But how far do you think they can go? I mean, we've seen the likes of Dwight Yorke come through. We've seen tremendous athletes in general, but how far do you think they can go in terms of a well-standing competitively?
I would say, I mean, for a nation like Grenada, They have a big diaspora population. They have a big diaspora population in London. They have in Toronto, in New York. So not only do you have the 100,000+ on the island, you can also call on players to come out, and they're seeing that at the moment. Grenada are one win away from reaching the Gold Cup for the first time in 10 years, I think, because they're starting to attract a lot of the boys in the UK who have a Grenadian grandparent or parent, and that's really changing the way they're coming out with the professional environment, the academy infrastructure that they've come out of. And so I really believe if they did things properly, a country like Grenada could get to the World Cup, especially with the expanded tournament in 2026. And Grenada is one of the smaller ones. So if you're talking about Jamaica or one of the bigger nations in the region, they could really push. They could definitely get out of out of the group phases in the World Cup. But there is so much work to be done off the field. There's so many kind of barriers off the field that is the main reason why you don't see them consistently participating in tournaments, that you're not seeing players coming out. I mean, for me, it's not even a question. If you had a real clear and well organised, well functioning grassroots system across the islands, you would be getting 2 or 3 world-class talents out every couple of years. There's no doubt about that.
Absolutely. No, that's a great point. And we saw a few years ago when Jamaica qualified, and they gave a good account of themselves in the World Cup as well. And a combination of players through the system, but also players that may have been born there or born abroad, who've got parents from there, can go a long way to getting a really strong competitive team going forward. So that's really interesting one in that respect. And in terms of yourself, where do you sort of see? I mean, you've sort of travelled everywhere and you've been to so many places. It's been a really fascinating insight into what you've done and what you've achieved and where you've been. And in terms of yourself, where do you sort of see yourself going from where you are now? It's just like you pretty much travelled everywhere. I suppose your focus now is the role you're doing now. But where do you see yourself moving forward in the role you're in now, and perhaps give us some insight in terms of beyond that, or perhaps you're just looking at the role you've got at the moment without looking too far ahead. Where do you sort of see yourself going forward?
I mean, I guess from a football point of view, it's become clear to me, or clearer and clearer, that the mental side of the game is the biggest gap in the system. Is that throughout all of the environments and all of the study visits that I've done, there is not enough work being done around how you develop a young athlete's mindset. And I think what happens is players are selected on their technical or their physical or these very football-based concepts. They're selected for academies at a young age based on that. And then when it comes to deciding if they're going to be a pro, the decision is made based purely on their mentality. But at no point throughout the whole process has there been any mental training, any of the work that would prepare them. And I think that's one of the biggest reasons why you have a success rate, or what they call it a success rate, that rate of players who they select at under 8 reaching professional level is incredibly low. It's like it's below acceptable for me, because I think the focus is all wrong. Technique and physicality are 2 important ingredients, but they are the ingredients that you take, and then you need to give that player a professional mindset, and you need to be working on that from minute 1. So from a personal point of view, sports psychology, in the areas of mental toughness, grit, all of these kind of buzzwords, I'm really trying to immerse myself in that and understand how I can make sure that every training session, every interaction I have with players and teams is doing that, is not just a football session, but how are we training the minds of players. And so I really see over the next few years I want to become an expert in that. I want to make that the next level of my coaching. And then in terms of what next for football, I mean, I'm just getting started with this project here, and I really got a taste for what can be done with a residential academy in Uganda, and I'm in the process of working on setting up a residential academy here in the region, in the Caribbean, because I believe that's the best way to make the difference, is to take those elite young players, give them the context and the environment that they need, and then help them to get out. So yeah, I see myself being here for a period of time now, because there's a lot of work to be done, and it's a very exciting project once we can get it going.
Yeah, no, absolutely, and it's a great insight, and certainly I echo the sentiments around the psychology and the mental side of the game. It's a growing area, but it still is a long way to go, and even in my experience, some of the leading establishments and clubs in the world have still got a lot of developing to do in that area, albeit we've seen how instrumental it is in players developing, not just as footballers but as people too, outside the game, being able to equip themselves with life's demands after playing football too. That's a huge thing too. But it's been a really fascinating insight, Harry, into your world. I'm sure the listeners have really enjoyed it, and I do encourage them to send us an email on our Sports Friday Sports Facebook page, and any questions they might have. It's been a really incredible insight in terms of your experience, and I think the great thing about yourself is the experiences you've had, you can apply them to sport, but almost everything really, going forward. And I'm very confident that the next chapter will be a successful one for you. But I want to thank you for coming on board the show, Harry. It's been really fascinating, no doubt, for our guests, and it's been really fascinating for me to get an amazing insight into your experiences around the world.
Thank you very much. It's been a real pleasure. So I've really enjoyed the opportunity to share what my football journey's been so far.
Yeah, no, thank you. And it's only just beginning in one sense. I'm sure that you'll go on to many more amazing adventures and experience. Thanks again, Harry. I really appreciate that.
Thank you.
And that was Harry Varley on the Friday Sports Show, Salford City Radio 94.4 FM, with your host Jimmy Petruzzi. What a fascinating insight into the world of football around the world. And it truly was an amazing insight into the experiences of someone who's worked in so many different countries and experienced so many different cultures. And do get in touch and let us know your thoughts, and if you've worked anywhere that Harry has, or if you've got any questions about what he's done, it'd be interesting to get your thoughts on our Facebook page. But it's been a fantastic show. I've really enjoyed it. I hope you've enjoyed it too. Until next time, the Friday Sports Show, Salford City Radio 94.4 FM. Your host is Jimmy Petruzzi. Have a fantastic weekend, whatever you are, whatever you're doing. Thank you.